Well, today we're going to venture into some new territory and have some fun with a big live edge slab. I love you.
Hit it!
One of the things I looked forward to the most about moving to Denver was the possibility of having access to more slabs. And let me tell you, there's some really great vendors around here. Recently, I went to CS Woods. It's Collector Specialty Woods in Denver. And oh my goodness, do they have a selection of slabs. It's going to knock your socks off. Let's check it out. CS Woods is located in a very unassuming warehouse off Monaco Street in Denver. Up front is the office where you'll get just a little taste of what's to come. In the warehouse, things get a little nuts. I've honestly never seen a collection like this with wall-to-wall live edge slabs. Most of the slabs are adorned with natural imperfections serving as Mother Nature's fingerprint, making each one truly unique. This place is like a woodworker's Disney World. After picking my jaw up off the floor, I finally honed in on a small slab of Claro walnut. They let me spray it down with orange oil so that I could see the grain, and it was love at first sight. So here's the Claro walnut slab that came home with me, and I absolutely love it. If you're not familiar with what a live edge slab is, basically think of taking just a simple cross section of that tree and you have bark to bark on both ends. And that's what makes these things so magical, because it really is just a simple slice out of the tree. And you try to retain this roughness and these edges so that they actually are part of the showpiece that you're trying to show off. Now, slabs can use a lot of work at times. This one happens to be in incredibly good shape. It's nice and flat. They've already done that work for me, and there really isn't a lot to repair. I've got a little bit of checking here and there. I've got some worm or beetle holes, basically some kind of pest that made holes that will either fill or sort of strengthen them with some CA glue. And ultimately, all I have to do is a little bit of prep work, put this thing on legs, and I'm gonna have a nice little coffee table. First thing I'm gonna do is stabilize the end grain checking. In some areas, the checking goes in a few inches, and the extra tape helps prevent the epoxy from seeping out. I want to fill this entire bark inclusion, so I'll block the whole area with tape. Epoxy is my material of choice for stabilization, specifically West Systems 105 resin and 205 hardener. There's no dye being used here. The 205 hardener takes on this dark caramel color as it ages, so it works great for filling applications. I simply pour the epoxy onto the end grain, spread it around, and let the wood soak it up. Ideally, the epoxy will seep into the cracks and not only fill them, but stabilize them so that they don't crack again in the future. Just a quick tip, if the epoxy is cold, it'll be much more viscous. If you warm up the resin just a bit before adding the hardener, the epoxy will be much more runny and will do a better job of penetrating the cracks and crevices. Over the course of a few minutes, you should see areas where the epoxy soaks in, so just push more epoxy into those cracks. Now I let the slab sit overnight. When I peel the tape away, you can see how the epoxy worked its way through the slab and into the checks and cracks. Now for the wormholes. If they're filled with sawdust, you can drop some thin CA glue on top and it should suck it right up. If you prefer to epoxy the holes, simply dig out that sawdust and then apply the epoxy. Now on the underside, we definitely have an issue that needs to be repaired, and if you put your finger over it, you can kind of hear that it's fairly unstable. It's not really well supported. So we're going to want to fill this with epoxy, but you always have to be concerned when you see a hole in terms of where that hole goes, right? So let's flip this over, and you can see there's actually this little divot in there. So chances are, if I just try to fill all that with epoxy, it's probably going to start pouring through here. And I can't really tape this area off. So one thing that you can do, it's kind of a neat trick, is to use CA glue, and I could pour some into this little crack here and try to use my quick set activator to seal it up from this side. And then I'll be able to pour epoxy safely in from the other side. Now we should hopefully be able to fill this with epoxy and not have it just pouring out the other end. So I've pretty much filled everything that I can fill, and I let the epoxy dry overnight so it's nice and firm. And at this point we need to make some decisions about the final size and shape of this slab, and a lot of that relates to the legs and their position. So let's see how things lay out. Now I've got the slab upside down because we're going to look at the legs. Right now these are locally fabricated legs, always cool to support a local craftsman if you can, and we're going to put one on each side. Now these things are nice and heavy duty, and I think the rectangular shape really fits the theme of the table, because even though it's got two live edges, it really is a simple rectangular shape overall. So where to place these legs kind of depends on what's going on with the edges. I don't know that these two ends are parallel to one another, so if I use that as a guide to line up each one of my legs, I don't know that my legs are going to be, parallel with each other. They might be skewed. Right, so let's see if we can put some sort of imaginary reference lines. And what I mean by imaginary is we don't really have a straight side to work with, do we? We've got a very curved live edge here, and then one that's very wavy. And even though this is wavy, you do still have sort of the ability to imagine a straight line going through this side. So what I'm going to do is take a straight edge, drop it in place, just kind of eyeball what seems to look straight to my eye, and drop in a line. Now, using a large square, I'm just going to drop it in place and roughly mark out a square reference line for the end. Well, as you can see, we've got a little bit of a taper here, so let's see how the other side works out. Now, this one kind of has a similar taper to it, which means our slab actually flares out this way. So if this is something you feel strongly about and you want to correct, a circular saw or a track saw is the way to do it. As we make these cuts, we're also removing that outer layer of epoxy. Keep in mind, if you cut too deep, you're more likely to expose a fresh, unfilled crack. I had to cut mine in 2 passes since it didn't quite remove all the glue the first time around. So the ends are looking pretty good. Now we just need to clean the surfaces. We've got that epoxy sitting there, and all you really need to do is scrape or sand it back and then sand the entire surface nice and smooth. The trick here is the live edge. That's a little bit trickier to sand because it's not flat, right? So there's a lot of different things you can do. You could use wire brushes, you can use those wire brush attachments for a drill, you could use flap sanders, you could even go at it with hand tools if you wanted to, but you gotta be careful not to kill the natural contours. I'm going to try something a little bit different. I'm going to go with sandblasting. Now, I have done some sandblasting in the past with a real serious pro rig, but this was cheap. This was a little gun that holds the sand in the top, and you just connect it to the compressor, and I don't know, we'll see what happens. Hopefully this wasn't a waste of money. But if I can sandblast the edge, that's a great way to abrade the surface, allow it to maintain the natural contours, but you could still clean it up nicely without killing the look. So let's get to it. There's a little too much epoxy buildup in some of these areas, so I'll use my carving tools to remove as much as I can. Even if I dig into the wood surface, the curved profile of the carving gouge retains a fairly natural look. The gun runs at about 90 psi. The abrasive is Black Beauty Extra Fine Blast Media. It runs about $27 for a 25-pound bag, and I really should get myself a funnel. I'll do the work in my driveway, but I'll first throw down a big tarp. If I can recover any of the blasting medium, I'd like to, and hopefully the tarp will catch a lot of it. Now with a face shield on, I'll give this thing a whirl. It's working pretty well, but it's clear that it won't be effective over the epoxy, so we'll come back to that area in a minute. As you can see, it's doing a really nice job everywhere else, but again, we have more stubborn epoxy here. So with the carving tools, I take the time to remove as much of the epoxy as possible. The other live edge is much easier and just requires a nice, even blasting. One of the corners has a lot of bark, and I'll remove that with a carving gouge. And just for fun, I wanted to see if this stuff could strip paint, and it really has no problem with the white project paint, but it takes a little longer on what I'm assuming is a powder-coated finish. Now this is a pretty fine grit, so I wasn't expecting a miracle here, but it does eventually make it through. The entire slab gets sprayed down with compressed air, as does the camera, and my own nooks and crannies. Believe me, that abrasive goes everywhere. Rolling up the tarp, I was able to recover a good amount of the abrasive. Well, I gotta say, that was a real blast. Now, when it comes to sandblasting, there are a lot of different products on the market, but today we've just scratched the surface. Of course, I realize these are super corny, but it's better than abrasive jokes. Now we can do the final finish prep. I use a cabinet scraper to smooth the faces and save myself some low grit sanding. From there, I start with 180 grit and work my way up to 320. On the ends, you need to balance the sander carefully, but the 2-inch wide surface is pretty easy to work with. Sanding this end grain is absolutely crucial since there's so much of it present in the final table. I use a small roundover bit to break the sharp edges. The live edges are now pretty sharp too, so I'll use a fine rasp to create an 1/8 inch wide flat. If I encounter any weak areas, I just keep removing stock until it's gone and then reshape the edge. The final shaping is done with sandpaper as I smooth the transition between the sharp edge and the live surface. And now it's time for finishing. The finish will be some simple wipe-on poly. While you normally wipe this stuff on with a rag, there's no reason you can't use a brush. Notice I'm coating the bottom surface first, this way I can flip it over and work on the top. And if the painter's pyramids leave any sort of marks, they'll be on the underside. Once the first coat dries, I lightly sand with 500 grit paper and recoat. Before applying coat number 3, I sand again with 500 grit paper, and then sand the live edges lightly with 500 grit abrasive sanding pads. I'm not trying to sand thoroughly here, just smoothing out the high points. We're getting close to our final coat, so it's a good idea to vacuum the surface thoroughly. For the 4th and final coat, I'll dilute the finish with some mineral spirits so that it's really thin, and then wet the surface thoroughly. The diluted poly will act as a lubricant for my sander with a 2000 grit wet dry sanding pad attached. I've got the sander on a pretty slow speed because I'm really just buffing the surface here, and I don't want to remove a lot of cured finish. Now I wipe off the excess finish and let it cure. Believe me when I tell you that this surface is just about the smoothest thing you've ever felt. Now we need to turn our attention to the legs. To allow for wood movement, I'm widening the outside sets of holes. Now we can place the legs. Honestly, these legs are just a bit large for this slab, but I can make them work. At the center of each hole, I use a brad point bit to tap an indentation. Then using a 1-inch bolt and washer, I determine how deep I need to drill and mark it with some tape. To attach the bolts to the slab, I'm using Wood Whisperer thread taps, so I need to start by drilling a pilot hole. Next, I use a 1/4-inch tap and tap the threads right in the slab. Now I can attach the leg assemblies with the 1/4-inch bolts. I'm using a socket wrench here, but remember these threads are made of wood, so this is overkill. I should really be using a hand driver. Well, here is my new coffee table, which will soon be loaded down with milk and Cheerios and all kinds of fun things. But as you can see, a live edge slab table like this is actually pretty darn simple. You just have to prep the slab, stabilize it, put a good finish on it, and then stay out of the way. right? If you over-design the legs and the base, it kind of could compete with the top, and you don't want to do that. You really want a sort of minimalist design to the base and legs, and this way the top is the showpiece. You're not sort of competing one with the other. So really quick project. This almost reminds me of turning, right? When you turn, you get a sort of immediate gratification. You get a finished product pretty quickly. The longest part of this project was applying the finish. So it went pretty well. Really happy with the results, and hopefully you'll get into some live edge slab building too, because I mean, really, it's a great way to harness Mother Nature's power to create something beautiful, and all we have to do is just showcase it. All right, thanks for watching.